December 22nd, 1849. Semyonovsky Square, St. Petersburg. Fyodor Dostoyevsky stands before a firing squad. He's 28 years old, a writer, a socialist, a believer in progress and reason and the perfectibility of man through rationalism. He's been condemned to death for reading forbidden literature, for discussing utopian socialism, for believing that human beings could build heaven on earth through logic and social engineering. The drums roll. The rifles are raised. Dostoevsky closes his eyes, certain that in 30 seconds he will cease to exist. That consciousness is simply matter, and when the bullets tear through his flesh, the whole beautiful illusion will simply end. And then, at the last possible second, a courier arrives. The Tsar has commuted their sentences. It was all theater, a psychological torture designed to break them. It worked. Dostoevsky would spend the next 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, surrounded by murderers and thieves, suffering epileptic seizures, watching men beaten to death, confronting the absolute rock bottom of human existence. And somewhere in that frozen hell, the rational socialist died. And something else was born. 17 years later, he would write Crime and Punishment. This is not a novel written by someone theorizing about suffering from a comfortable armchair. This is a book written by a man who stood before the void, was shattered by it, and lived to tell you everything you think you know is wrong. Let's talk about Raskolnikov's theory. And I mean really talk about it, not the cartoon version. Raskolnikov isn't just some random murderer. He's a crystallization of every progressive intellectual idea of the 1860s, distilled into one brilliant, starving, feverish young man. He's read his Chernyshevsky, his utilitarian calculus, the greatest good for the greatest number. He's absorbed the scientific materialism flooding through Russian universities. Consciousness is just brain states. Morality is just social conditioning. God is dead, and we can rebuild ethics from first principles using reason alone. He's also read his history. Napoleon slaughtered hundreds of thousands and became a legend. Alexander the Great burned cities, and we call him great. The extraordinary man, the world historical figure, transcends ordinary morality. They operate on a different plane. So Raskolnikov formulates his question. Am I a trembling creature bound by conventional morality? Or am I, like Napoleon, someone with the right to transgress? Notice the structure of the question. It's already materialist to its core. There is no God watching, no absolute moral law, no eternal soul that will be judged. There's just social utility, historical impact, and the will to power. He decides to test his theory empirically, like any good rationalist would. He'll murder Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker. She's old, useless, parasitic. She hoards money while students starve. Her death would be, on balance, a net positive for society. And if he can do it without remorse, it proves he's extraordinary. It's Bentham's philosophic calculus with an axe. But here's what Dostoevsky understood that the utilitarians didn't. Human beings are not rational agents in a frictionless moral vacuum. We're these strange, contradictory creatures with this thing called conscience that doesn't give a damn about your utilitarian mathematics. The murder scene is one of the most visceral passages in all literature. Dostoevsky doesn't spare us. The axe doesn't fall cleanly. Alyona doesn't die instantly. There's blood, chaos, terror. And then, horror of horrors, Lizaveta walks in, Alyona's sister, the gentle, simple one, the one Raskolnikov actually liked. And he has to kill her too. 2 bodies, 2 women, and all of Raskolnikov's rational architecture collapses in about 90 seconds. Because theory is clean. Reality is blood and brain matter and a human being convulsing on the floor. What follows is a psychological disintegration of staggering precision. Raskolnikov doesn't get caught immediately. He hides the evidence. He has time to escape. But he can't escape himself. He's burning with fever, raving, paranoid. He thought murdering his conscience would be the hard part. Turns out you can't murder conscience. You can only ignite it into an all-consuming inferno. This is Dostoyevsky's genius. He doesn't refute rational egoism through argument. He refutes it through phenomenology. He shows you from the inside what it actually feels like to treat another human being as an arithmetic problem. And it feels like hell. Now, we need to talk about the historical context, because Crime and Punishment isn't written in a vacuum. The 1860s in Russia were a period of radical ferment. Serfdom had just been abolished. Young intellectuals were devouring Western philosophy. Fourier's socialism, Feuerbach's materialism, Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, which argued that rational self-interest properly understood would create a perfect society. These weren't idiots. These were brilliant people who looked at the suffering caused by religion, superstition, and autocracy, and thought, we can do better. We can rebuild morality on reason. We can engineer the perfect society. Dostoevsky had believed this too, until the firing squad, until Siberia, until he lived among the people the intelligentsia claimed to want to save, and realized how little the theories matched reality. By the time he wrote Crime and Punishment, he'd become something the progressives hated: a conservative, an orthodox Christian, a defender of traditional morality. Not because he was stupid, not because he hadn't read the philosophy, but because he'd lived through the consequences of ideas. He'd seen what happens when you try to reduce the human soul to matter and morality to mathematics. And here's the thing that makes people uncomfortable. Maybe he was right. The philosophical core of the novel is the clash between two worldviews, two anthropologies, two answers to the question, what is a human being? The materialist answer, which Raskolnikov embodies: a human is a physical system. Consciousness is brain activity. Morality is either evolutionary adaptation or social construct. There is no inherent dignity, no sacred soul, no objective good and evil. There's just matter in motion, and we can organize that matter however we see fit to maximize utility. Dostoevsky's answer embodied in Sonya. A human is an image of God, a soul, something that transcends material reduction, something that can be loved, forgiven, redeemed, something that exists in relationship not just to other matter, but to the transcendent. The entire novel is these two views in mortal combat, and Dostoevsky stacks the deck brilliantly against himself. Sonya is a prostitute, forced into degradation to feed her family. She has every reason to be a materialist, to see life as meaningless suffering, to abandon morality as a cruel joke. She has no social power, no education, no rational arguments. What does she have? The Gospels, faith, the ability to love someone as broken as Raskolnikov without condition, the ability to see the image of God in a murderer. Raskolnikov has all the logic. Sonya has all the truth. Let's talk about suffering, because this is where Dostoevsky really goes deep, and where he really diverges from both progressivism and conservatism as usually understood. The progressive view of suffering is essentially, it's a problem to be solved. Through social engineering, through science, through rational organization, we can minimize suffering and maximize pleasure. This is the whole utilitarian project. The conservative view, at least the shallow version, is often our suffering builds character. Toughen up. It's good for you. Dostoevsky's view is more terrifying and more profound. Suffering is the price of consciousness itself. To be human is to suffer. not because God is cruel, but because to love is to make yourself vulnerable. To be moral is to feel guilt. To be conscious is to be aware of death and finitude and all the ways we fail. You can escape suffering. Raskolnikov tries. You can kill your conscience, embrace rational egoism, treat other humans as objects. But then you're not human anymore. You're a machine. And machines don't find meaning. They just run programs until they break. Or you can accept suffering. You can embrace your humanity with all its weakness, its capacity for guilt, its need for forgiveness. You can kneel in the public square, kiss the earth, and confess, I am a murderer. I need redemption. That's what Raskolnikov eventually does. Not because Porfiry the detective proved he did it. Porfiry knew, but couldn't prove it. Not because he feared punishment, but because continuing to live as a Superman was spiritual death. And confession, humiliation, prison, suffering were paradoxically the path back to being human. The epilogue is crucial. Dostoyevsky doesn't end with Raskolnikov's confession. He takes us to Siberia. And here's where you see Dostoyevsky working directly from experience. He knows what Siberian prison is like. He lived it. The criminals there don't like Raskolnikov because he's an intellectual, because he killed for a theory rather than passion or need. They beat him. He's isolated, suffering, broken. And yet, slowly, painfully, through Sonya's presence, through reading the Gospels, through something that can't be rationalized or explained in materialist terms, Raskolnikov experiences what can only be called grace. Not happiness, not comfort, grace. The sense that even here, in the worst place, having done the worst thing, he is still human, still loved, still capable of redemption. The book ends with an opening. But here begins a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man. Dostoevsky doesn't give us the redemption. He gives us the possibility of redemption. And that possibility only exists because he rejects materialism. Because if we're just matter, there's nothing to redeem. There's just deterministic processes playing out. But if we're souls, then even a murderer in Siberia can be reborn. Here's the uncomfortable question. Was Dostoevsky right? We live in a time where the materialist view has essentially won in the academy, in science, in mainstream culture. Consciousness is neurons. Morality is preference. There's no soul, no God, no transcendent meaning. And what have we gotten? Well, we've gotten tremendous technological progress, medical advances, liberation from superstition. That's real. That matters. But we've also gotten epidemics of depression, anxiety, nihilism, and suicide. We've gotten ideologies that treat humans as expendable in service of historical progress. And those ideologies killed 100 million people in the 20th century. We've gotten a culture where everything is permitted because nothing is sacred. Maybe the materialists are right, and that's just the price of truth. Maybe we need to be grown-ups and accept that life is meaningless and build whatever meaning we can from our preferences. Or maybe Dostoevsky was right. Maybe when you kill God, you don't liberate man. You just remove the only thing that made human dignity coherent. Maybe rational egoism doesn't lead to a better society. Maybe it leads to Raskolnikov, alone in his room, calculating murder. I'm not telling you what to believe, but I am telling you that Dostoevsky lived through the consequences of these ideas in ways most philosophers never have. He stood before the firing squad. He lived in the camps. He wrestled with the void. And he came back saying, the materialists are wrong, not because they're stupid, but because they're missing something essential about what it means to be human. Let's bring this back to you and me, to us. to the human beings watching this. You've probably never murdered anyone. But have you ever tried to live by pure logic? To optimize your life like a machine? To treat relationships as transactions, morality as social conditioning you can ignore when convenient? Meaning as something you construct rather than discover? How'd that work out? Or maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you've felt the weight of guilt for things you've done or failed to do. Maybe you've wondered if you're just atoms bouncing around, if your suffering means nothing, if there's any possibility of redemption, or if you're just stuck with who you are forever. Crime and Punishment speaks to both of these. To the rationalist, your logic will destroy you. To the guilty, there is a path through suffering to grace. But that path requires abandoning the comforting lie that we're just matter. It requires accepting that we're something stranger, more vulnerable, more accountable, more capable of love and evil than materialism allows. It requires becoming fully human. Dostoyevsky wrote Crime and Punishment in a state of absolute desperation. He was in debt. His first wife had died. His brother had died. He was gambling compulsively. He wrote the novel in serial installments under crushing deadlines, sometimes delivering pages straight from his hand to the printer. And somehow, in that state, he produced one of the most profound meditations on human nature ever written. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe you need to be desperate to write truthfully about desperation. Maybe you need to have been broken to write about redemption. The young Dostoyevsky, the socialist who believed in progress and reason, couldn't have written this book. The old Dostoyevsky, the one who'd been through the fire, could. That's the trajectory of most human lives, isn't it? Young and progressive and certain you can fix everything with the right theory. Older and conservative, not politically necessarily, but existentially. Aware of how complicated things are, how much wisdom is embedded in traditions you once dismissed, how little your theories matter when you're actually suffering. Crime and Punishment is what happens when a brilliant mind that's been shattered by reality tries to save you from making the same mistakes. So here's what I'm asking you to consider. Maybe meaning isn't something we construct. Maybe it's something we discover or fail to discover. Maybe morality isn't just social conditioning. Maybe conscience is real, and when you violate it, you pay a price no rational argument can talk you out of. Maybe suffering isn't just a problem to be engineered away. Maybe it's an essential part of being conscious, and the question isn't how to avoid it, but what it means. Maybe we're not just matter. Maybe we're souls, and maybe that matters more than you think. Crime and Punishment is Dostoevsky's case against the modern world's most fundamental belief, that we can reduce everything to atoms and logic and still have meaningful human lives. He's saying, you can't. You can try. Raskolnikov tried. It led him to murder and madness. Or you can accept your humanity, with all its weakness, its guilt, its need for forgiveness, its irrational hunger for meaning. You can kiss the earth. You can confess. You can suffer consciously rather than flee into ideology. And maybe, just maybe, on the other side of that suffering, there's something like grace. The genius of Crime and Punishment is that it doesn't argue, it shows. It takes you inside Raskolnikov's head and lets you feel what rational egoism actually feels like from the inside. And it feels like hell. Because hell isn't fire and demons. Hell is being cut off from your own humanity. Hell is treating people as objects. Hell is living by logic alone. And redemption isn't a warm feeling. It's kneeling in the public square. It's prison. It's humiliation. It's admitting you were wrong about everything. But it's also the only path back to being real. Dostoevsky knew this because he lived it. And he spent the rest of his life trying to tell us. Maybe we should listen. Thanks for watching. If this made you uncomfortable, good. That means something true got through. We live in Raskolnikov's world, the world where everything can be calculated, optimized, rationalized. Where conscience is just programming and meaning is just preference. But we also live in Dostoyevsky's world, the world where souls are real, where guilt matters, where redemption is possible. The question is, which world is true? I know which one Dostoevsky bet his life on. See you in the next one.